Thank you, Michael, and welcome everyone. We're really excited that you're all here for the first Educational Policy Studies Lunch and Learn of the fall semester. I want to begin with a land acknowledgement. The University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dejope since time immemorial. In addition, UW-Madison was funded in its formative years by the sale of land seized from indigenous peoples in what is now northern Wisconsin. It is important to understand how we are implicated in these histories of colonization. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the other 11 First Nations of Wisconsin. I am delighted to introduce you all to Dr. CJ Pascoe. Dr. Pascoe is a sociologist, speaker, writer, and expert on inequality, youth, and schooling. She is an award-winning teacher and associate professor of sociology at the University of Oregon, where she teaches classes on schools, inequality, social psychology, culture, and sexuality. She has published numerous peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters, co-edited or co-authored 3 books, and currently serves as a co-editor of the academic journal Socius, Sociological Research for a Dynamic World. In addition to her academic work, Dr. Pascoe writes for and speaks with public audiences on issues including bullying, harassment, gender inequality, and homophobia, and she has partnered with various organizations that support young people. Dr. Pascoe is perhaps best known as an award-winning school ethnographer. Her first book, Dude, You're a Fag, Masculinity and Sexuality in High School, won the American Educational Research Association's Book of the Year Award, and her most recent book, Nice is Not Enough, Inequality and the Limits of Kindness at American High, which she'll be speaking with us about today, explores how inequities persist in a school that is committed to acceptance, connection, and kindness. Please join me in welcoming Dr. CJ Pascoe.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. I really appreciate it, Emily. And I will note in a little moment of celebration for myself that as of Monday, just 3 days from now, I will officially be a full professor. It's been a long journey, and I'm excited to finally have that happening. So thank you for having me here. This is my first talk of this particular school year, and so I'm really excited to be here with you all virtually, at least. And I think this is an especially exciting time to be talking about the work that emotions do in schools and in society at large, especially because we're in a moment and we're coming off a year in which students across the country have been demanding that we move beyond platitudes in our educational institutions. So I want to sort of hold that in our heads as we move through this talk today. And so what I would like to do today is to talk a little bit about some of the findings in my new book, Nice is Not Enough, and reflect on how they might help us understand our current political and social moment. So I'll give you an overview of the book and then dive into a set of stories that will tell us something about the way struggles over equality work in public schools and perhaps in US life more generally. Now, as some of you know, my first high school ethnography, Dude, You're a Fag, Masculinity and Sexuality in High School, documented the centrality of boys' homophobic epithets and heterosexist discourses and practices to an establishment of a masculine identity in high school, as well as the way that those interactions and discourses were supported by and embedded in the institution of the school itself. So I was surprised and relieved after so many years of focusing on and documenting homophobic and sexist bullying, that when I walked into American high school, a working and middle class high school, although it was it was primarily white, although it was the most racially diverse high school in its overwhelmingly white district, I was just so relieved when I walked into the school and saw signs like these under a banner reading, "No room for hate." If I hear any homophobic comments, I will ask, why does it matter to you? If I hear people making racist jokes, I'll ask them to stop. If I see someone physically harassing someone else, I'll speak up and protect the victim. If I see or hear a sexist comment, I'll ask, how would you feel if that was you? And American High is just that kind of school. It's the kind of school where there is no room for hate, the kind of school where love and kindness characterize school culture. And I saw manifestations of this love and kindness at every turn. Students founded a Be Nice Club to promote kindness and inclusivity. On Valentine's Day, the cheerleaders posted these notes up on the blue lockers around the school, like, have a wonderful day, you're an amazing person. The girls' bathroom, it wasn't unusual to see signs like this cacophony of student-generated affirmations filling a large yellow piece of butcher paper. And so, given this the sort of visual culture of kindness, it wasn't unusual to hear people refer to American High as a special place. Lauren described American High as full of the sweetest people in the world. Lila says students would burn everybody alive if they were like mean. Everyone stands up for each other. I think it's awesome. It's like, oh, you're homophobic. That's not cool. You're a bully. That's not cool. Similarly, Devin describes American as full of violently accepting people. And even the parents concur with this sort of analysis. Emily, the mom of an American High student, said to me, folks at American will accept the bejesus out of you. And these young folks aren't just like making this up out of nowhere, right? This culture of kindness and acceptance at American was so pervasive that when the principal was meeting with the seniors to prepare them for graduation, he had to say to them, you can't just come back and hang out with your teachers after graduation, right? Now, I don't know about your high school experience, but I know my high school experience in the 90s, nobody wanted to go back to high school to hang out with their teachers, right? So I think that says something special about this particular place. And after spending 2 years in the classrooms and the hallways and the auditoriums of American, it became abundantly clear to me why so many students wanted to come back to hang out with their teachers. That sense of kindness and acceptance made American a space that was hard to leave. Now, you know, there's a but that's coming. As I came to discover during my time there, this kindness and acceptance has limits. These limits became clear when young people and staff took stands against systemic racism, when young folks demanded safer schools and inclusive mental health care, when girls grappled with gender inequalities and harassment, and when long-standing rituals shifted in an attempt to become more inclusive. In other words, what was happening in the hallways at American High was a little more complicated than this culture of kindness seemed to indicate. And this became very clear to me on the day of the annual senior assembly. Now, the senior assembly is this assembly that happens towards the end of the year to celebrate the seniors. The teachers do a special choreographed dance for the seniors, and at the end, the seniors run through this like tunnel made by the teachers' arms, and everybody celebrates, and it's just this sort of wonderful celebratory occasion. But it starts off with the national anthem, as do most assemblies. And so I walk in to the gym as the first strains of the national anthem are playing and the show choir begins to sing, and I'm standing with all the teachers and staff, and I notice as the song is progressing that there's some rustling over in the group of teachers and staff next to me. And I watch as Max, the only out trans teacher in the school, slowly drops to one knee in a move that we now all recognize in terms of the protest that was popularized by Colin Kaepernick to call attention to racist police violence. So he drops to one knee. And then slowly, several other teachers follow. Most of the other staff don't even look. They keep looking at the students singing, and no students follow their lead. And then the song ends, the teachers stand up, and the assembly continues. Now, the apparent normalcy that sort of briefly followed that kneeling, however, belied the social and emotional weight of that brief protest. We watched as community members weighed in, parents shared thoughts, the principal expressed displeasure. And it turned out that the teachers who knelt even received formal letters of reprimand from the district that were placed in their personal files. When I spoke to Max, the teacher who began the kneeling, when I spoke to him afterwards, he said that these letters served as warnings that should their behavior continue, it would serve as a fireable offense. According to the letters, making a public statement against racist police violence constituted an act of political expression, and political acts like these were forbidden during the workday. So, American High may be no place for hate, but is no place for politics either. At a school where folks will accept the bejesus out of you, kneeling to protest the murder of Black Americans becomes an issue not of hate, acceptance, or justice. It becomes one of politics. American High, in other words, like a lot of high schools across the US, where parental fears of politicizing schools have determined school policies, reading material, course content, and the ability of students to exist safely and be free from harassment or fear. Now, this wasn't my only time, or this wasn't the only time at American that a concept of the political was invoked to quell actions related to social issues. A brief glance at the football team's social media page, for instance, shows us this particular quote. "We are here to have fun and focus on the athletes, not on politics or anything destructive. We will not tolerate negativity, profanity, or any references to race, religion, or sexual orientation." In fact, when a beloved white teacher, Seth, wrote an email to his colleagues at American, where he expressed concern about rising racist, sexist, transphobic, homophobic, and xenophobic rhetoric, he was told to discontinue using email for, quote, political discussions. When students plan to memorialize young lives lost to gun violence and advocate for safer schools after being forced to sit through yearly soul-crushing lockdown trainings, the principal wrote in an email home about their protest, "Politics in the schoolhouse is not okay." When students in the Climate Action Club made plans to participate in a global youth protest to demand action on climate change, they were told they couldn't put up this particular flyer because a walkout demanding a habitable planet was, quote, political. But Cameron, who is a senior member of the Climate Action Club behind this particular action, made the astute point one day that school authorities actually do allow some political projects. He said, "There's a Young Republicans Club. That's actually about politics." And his point is an important one because it does raise this question of what we mean when we call something political. Cameron's analysis suggests that politics doesn't necessarily have to do with the formal processes of governing or political parties. And after spending time participating in the social world of American High, I would suggest that what is going on in this schoolhouse and in schoolhouses across the country is profoundly political, and that an emphasis on kindness and acceptance is a way we try to avoid whatever it is we mean by the political. Now, Andrew Perrin and Nina Eliasov, both sociologists, point out that the political has long been seen as a contaminant in terms of civil discourse. It violates the rules of politeness and threatens our ability to sustain community with one another. Politics, as the football team's social media page suggests, is a priori destructive. However, as Cameron points out in his critique of the way the Republican Club is not considered by school authorities to be problematically political, the political is not always the same as partisan or formal politics. So what is it? Well, as Perrin points out in his book, The Democratic Imagination, political talk specifically addresses issues of power, resource distribution, or public morality. In other words, when we call something political, we don't mean capital P political. We mean social inequality, we mean values, we mean who gives or receives resources, whose voices and needs count, and who gets to make decisions about these things. In other words, inequality and the ideologies that justify or challenge inequality are the things of politics. So if any political talk is off limits at American High, what fills in for it? A language of kindness and acceptance. But the school's embrace of this sort of kindness culture exists without seriously addressing racial, sexual, gender, or class inequalities. Too often, those issues regarded as political. And this leaves school members without language to address many of the inequalities that such a culture of kindness should theoretically ameliorate. So what's happening at American in this sense may be a version of what scholar James Thomas calls a diversity regime, or a culture that seems to include a commitment to diversity, but that commitment may actually obscure or intensify existing inequality. Now, increasingly, scholars have been documenting the way mostly white and progressive schools have documented what Lewis and Diamond have famously called a shallow commitment to diversity, and the way that these shallow commitments can be obscured by good intentions. Now, primarily, this research has focused on racial inequality. And today I want to build on these insights about racial inequality by looking at how good intentions may reproduce multiple and intersecting lines of inequality: race, gender, class, and in terms of race, gender, class, and sexuality. To do that, I'll build on work that suggests that organizations themselves are racialized, gendered, and sexualized. Schools are understudied from this sort of organizational perspective because often such work focuses on the workplace as the paradigmatic organizational form, and less often focuses on things like churches or schools or other civil organizations. So my time at American suggests that bringing an organizational lens to bear on schools can exemplify how intersectional inequalities and privileges are reproduced through a regime of kindness, one that prioritizes being nice over grappling with political topics. Finally, building on education, feminist, and intersectional theories, I suggest how we can and should focus less on kindness and more on systematizing care to address these inequalities. So briefly here, I'll touch on my methods, and I'm happy to talk more about these later. American High is a school of about 1,000 students. It's under-enrolled because it doesn't have the reputation of the very wealthy school down the road. About half the students are college going, about half are economically disadvantaged. We got about 2/3 who are regular attenders. This is pre-pandemic. Things have shifted a bit since then. You can see the racial ethnic breakdown here. Again, this is the most racially diverse school in its district, and it is more racially diverse than Oregon as a whole. I did 51 interviews. Sociologists are really big on counting things, so I always throw the interviews in there. But I always sort of add a caveat to those interviews. I do not think interviews are or formal interviews are the best way of talking to young people, because they bring to bear all sorts of age, class, and often gender inequalities. So look at that with a bit of caution. Most of the data was drawn from my 2 years of observational and participatory research, and some document analysis as well. So the regime of kindness that I document at American High is part of what I came to call a politics of protection, and the title of this talk, or the way that dangers, threats, or harms to young folks are framed as random, external, and individual, not necessarily as preventable, systemic, or related to social inequalities. In Nice is Not Enough, I document the various ways that a politics of protection can appear in terms of race, gender, sexuality, class, and their intersections. Students at American, for instance, suggest that racial inequality is sugarcoated as a part of a larger project of benign diversity, in which love and kindness are deployed to solve the problems of racial inequality. Girls are left to navigate edicts of kindness as they embrace a girl boss feminism, a sort of gendered resilience with which they confront the daily onslaught of symbolic, discursive, or physical gendered violence. Raced, classed, and gendered privilege intersect in the production of what I came to think of as a student citizen, a production in which this privilege gets disguised as merit and obfuscated by an ideology of tolerance. However, and I always need to say this because sociologists are so focused on sad stories, I want to make the case that the book does not, in the end, tell a sad story. Because in the book, I also document the way that youth activists at American High, often empowered by adult allies, push back against this regime of kindness. Their resistance creates space and demands possibilities for a more just and equitable organization and society. So by tracing out these logics, resistance to them, and documenting alternative framings of inequality in American High, Nice is Not Enough offers up a solution by drawing on feminist and educational theories to suggest a politics of care, or an approach to power, resource distribution, and public morality that centers human needs, vulnerabilities, and systemic disparities, rather than relying on individual responses like kindness and acceptance as solutions. So I want to continue by diving deeper into one set of these dynamics, the politics of protection, to illustrate how focusing on inequality as an individual problem of bullying or meanness can elide the ways that intersectional inequalities get built into an organization itself. A politics of protection produces an intersectional privilege in the way that race, gender, class, and sexuality come together, not just to marginalize some students, but to protect, benefit, and empower already privileged students by making this privilege look like merit. So to tell you about how this works, I want to bring you into what was possibly the most amazing night of fieldwork I ever had, when I got to go to a high school drag show. Now, mind you, I was at American just before everybody started to sort of freak out about this gorgeous queer ritual we know as drag. No one was yet protesting drag queen story hours for kids or calling drag performers groomers, pedophiles, or predators. It was just before, at last count, 14 states had introduced or attempted to introduce anti-drag laws targeting queer communities. But even at that time, before this moral panic had gripped the nation, students in the Gay Straight Alliance, or the Gender and Sexuality Alliance, as they sort of shifted to be called, had to work hard to convince the school to let them have a drag show. They had to go before the operations committee and convince them that drag was an expression of gender performance, not, in the words of their advisor, a weird sex thing. Right? They had to convince them that they had to tell them that drag wasn't a weird sex thing because, as their advisor warned them, drag doesn't mean the same thing to someone who isn't in the queer community as it does to someone who is. So once they convinced the operations committee to let them have this drag show, the students in the Gay Straight Alliance, they worked hard for weeks. They contacted professional drag queens who taught them how to twirl and dance and put on makeup and put on these amazing outfits. And the result was that on a very cold winter night, about 70 friends and family came to American High to see a drag show hosted by a professional drag queen, Queen Quixotic, and her house, the House of the Ridiculous Absurd. And Queen Quixotic opened the show by training the audience how to behave at a drag show. She taught them how to snap, how to say yes, how to like throw a dollar up on stage. And she said, you know, we would never have had something like this when I was growing up as a kid in the 80s in San Diego. And she tells the audience, you know, most people that think that drag is this, and she sort of motions to herself. She's wearing like a long red gown and has big, gorgeous brown hair. And so she says, you know, most people think drag is this, a cisgender man doing all this work, but that's not it. Drag is the performance of gender. It's the performance of our identity. And so with that, the show went on and the performances ranged from a queer identified assigned male at birth student, or genderqueer identified assigned male at birth student wearing a short burgundy bob wig and a badly fitting purple dress and a full face of makeup, dancing around to Selena Gomez's song, I Love You Like a Love Song, to the Schuyler sisters and Aaron Burr in drag, to a cisgender teacher, a cisgender straight teacher, lip syncing and playing his ukulele, and concluded with Max, again, the only out trans teacher in the school, performing a Billy Joel song. And when he gets up on stage, he's actually dressed as his drag persona, Pious Patty, and he's wearing a white dress, and he looks really sad. His head is bowed as if he's in prayer. And eventually, partway through the song, he disappears behind a screen. And when he comes back out from the screen, he's no longer sad. He's no longer wearing the white dress. He's wearing a transsexual menace t-shirt, which is his own from his days of activism, and a leather jacket and jeans, and he's dancing happily, right? And the house goes wild with applause, right? So at the end of the show, Queen Quixotic comes out and says, I want a safe future for our gender diverse siblings out there. Please never stop being yourself. You keep doing you. You see all these people out here. They all support you. The lights come up, Lady Gaga's Born This Way anthem comes on, and all the kids rush the stage and they're dancing with an exuberance you only usually see at things like football games and proms. So it was an incredible night. I sat in the back row crying through half the show. However, and not surprisingly, in the weeks that followed the drag show, there was some pushback. The GSA advisor, Rose, shared with me that some parents were not happy and some administrators were not happy. The principal got a few phone calls from parents, but I think the most sort of surprising response came from the equity coordinator at the district, Vanessa. She contacted the principal, who passed her concerns on to Rose, and then Rose shared them with the students at one of the weekly GSA meetings. And so when she shared the concerns, she said, first, Vanessa was concerned that trans students would be the target of public outrage and anger if there was pushback to the drag show. Second, Vanessa suggested that a drag show could be offensive to trans students because drag usually consists, she said, of cisgender folks dressing like the, quote, opposite sex. Third, the equity coordinator was concerned that the show could affect trans students who weren't out because, as she said, what if people asked to borrow a trans student's wig and that student wasn't out, could result in bullying. Now, the students in the GSA, as you can imagine, were not happy with this response. As Rose was sharing those concerns, they kept interrupting her with what and huh. At one point, students, at least two students, said, "I'm trans," as they laughed at Vanessa's concerns. And about half of the regular attenders at the GSA did not identify as cisgender. And so many of them expressed this sort of disbelief at this show, at this response and these concerns to the show they had worked so hard on. And in addition to their disbelief, many also said how powerful it was to watch one of their cisgender teachers perform in drag, and to watch Max make the political statement he made. So while the equity coordinator is, of course, rightly concerned with transphobic bullying, we all want our trans youth to feel safe at school, and we know that like more than half of them do not right now. Her concern, at least according to the students, seems like it might be a little misplaced. In fact, not a single student reported to me homophobic or transphobic bullying during their time at American High. Their biggest concerns were not interactional ones that other students were going to be mean to them. They were organizational ones. They were upset about the fact that there was one gender inclusive bathroom. You can see the sign for it right here. And that bathroom, because of these particular rules that are on the sign, always had long lines, and it was totally out of the way in the front of the school. They could never get to it. They were upset about exclusionary rules for things like pink prom. That was the prom for the queer youth. And at pink prom, they had to have permission slips signed by their parents, whereas for regular prom, they didn't, which students were rightly concerned would out them to their parents. Um, and they were upset that there weren't queer rituals at the school, right? Like this drag show, that's the sort of recognition and organizational inclusion they were looking for. So they wanted to be organizationally included. They already felt included by their peers, right? And this idea that they would be organizationally included was so important to them that when discussing building a new school building in the district, the students actually made a list. The students in the GSA made a list of suggestions to send to the district about this new building, and their priority was gender neutral bathrooms. They said they needed to have more stalls than just one, they needed to be accessible, and there needed to be more than just one bathroom in the whole school. And the students sort of rightly pointed out that people will freak out about multiple occupancy gender neutral bathrooms, right? Which to my knowledge still actually don't exist throughout the district yet. And they actually did spend a whole other session updating the school district's formal policies about gender inclusivity in an attempt to make the organizations more inclusive. So these queer youth are making very concrete requests of the school and the district to change and update their policies about gender, to make it easier for students of all genders to experience bodily integrity by taking care of their needs, and to be able to participate in meaningful rituals without worried about being outed to their parents or subjected to a greater level of scrutiny than they would be if they were participating in heterosexually oriented rituals. So the problem here is how we think about student safety and where threats to students come from. The equity coordinator thinks the problem is bullying, and the GSA students think the problem is organizational inclusion. And I came to think of this approach as a sort of politics of protection approach, the way that dangers, threats, or harms to young folks' safety are framed as external, random, and individual, not necessarily as preventable, systemic, or related to inequality. In other words, rather than addressing systemic social problems, those things that are located in the realm of the political, we often seek to protect young people from things like violence, bullying, or mental health crises by dealing with those things as if they have little to do with larger social inequalities. And you can see here that the district has a very particular perception of who a trans student is, what their needs are, and how and where dangers to them exist. This is something that scholar Joe Latham calls a trans singularity, or a way of framing the experiences, identities, and dangers facing trans youth in a way that are informed by stories of trans adults who came of age in a very different time or social context. And then their needs get framed as divorced from a legacy of play, celebration, or irreverence that characterizes queer culture. And as such, this sort of real complex queer life becomes put outside of the legible for the school. An imagined trans youth who is always a potential victim is legible, but not the actual vibrant and agentic queer young people who are part of the drag show. And as a result, this sort of anti-drag sentiment at American High ends up looking a lot like policies in states that actively target queer youth. Now, I want to be clear about something. Drag does happen at American High elsewhere in the school, and nobody seems remotely concerned about it, even though it's been going on for years. Annually, in fact, a group of high status, mostly athlete, mostly white, mostly straight, and all cisgender boys compete in a popular philanthropy called the Mr. Eagle pageant, a philanthropy that always involves drag. The pageant, as one person described it, is a sort of reverse beauty pageant in which 8 boy contestants, under the guidance of 8 girl coordinators, compete in a series of fundraisers to raise money for a children's hospital unit using the quasi-pro-life catchphrase, "Save the babies." The coordinators and contestants are regularly called heroes, role models, and the face of the school by students, parents, and staff alike. And participants dress and drag so frequently as part of their fundraising efforts that one mom said, "They just like to dress up as girls. I have no idea why." From Disney princesses to Sharpay and Gabriella from High School Musical to Sandy and Rizzo from Grease, I watched each year as students these male students dressed up like girls. However, no matter how often they dressed in drag, these boys are never seen as bullies or as victims. Even more importantly, when they do drag, it's not part of a cultural tradition. Instead, it reinscribes binary gender norms, often through the use of humor and disgust. Take, for instance, what happened the year a group of contestants decided to perform the iconic Jingle Bell Rock scene from the movie Mean Girls. If you haven't seen the movie, the girls sing a very sexy version of the song Jingle Bell Rock at a school talent show. When the students got up on stage to perform this routine in outfits that looked much like these, the MC, George, introduces the skit, and he emphasizes the hilarity of white cisgender boys dressing in drag and dancing seductively, asking, "How many of you miss Christmas? Well, our next skit might ruin it for you." And the boys went on and danced. The audience laughed. The music ends, the laughter subsides, and the MC then says, "Merry Christmas, I guess. I don't know. You can't unsee that." You can't, that is, unsee a group of white, cisgender men dressed in skirts and tank tops dancing suggestively. The MC's comments reflect a way of thinking that suggests that there's something distasteful, horrifying, or inappropriate about men who dress and act in a manner we associate with women. And even though this pageant has been going on for years, it receives local news coverage and is well covered in the yearbook, it seems to evoke none of the concern that the actual drag show did. And I suggest this might be because the pageant functions as something like what Wendy Brown calls a tolerance ritual. Tolerance rituals cover over the workings of power as they exclude, not through explicit rules and regulations, but through the very organization of the ritual itself. In fact, the advisors of the pageant repeatedly say all are welcome to apply, even as working class youth, youth of color, and girls are constantly prevented from becoming contestants in this pageant. One time, when a student who said she had trouble organizing things and that she was on a 504 plan, but she wanted to apply to become a coordinator of the pageant, one of the girls that's in charge, she was told, all are welcome to apply. But of course, in the end, she is not allowed to become a coordinator because of her multiple levels of difference from the other coordinators who are typically high performing on the honors track, white and middle or upper middle class students. Not only that, almost all the students who participate, or all the students that I know of who are participated, identified as heterosexual, because heterosexuality becomes centered in the pageant, as you can sort of see with the drag performance they did in order to mock people who might dress in drag. There are constantly jokes, in fact, about how many times the coordinators, who are all girls, and the contestants, who are all boys, pair up. One adult advisor even shares with us that she was a coordinator, and eventually she married a Mr. Eagle. That said, the pageant is run, even though the boys are the ones who get the credit and they're the ones who perform the pageant, the girls are the ones who do all the work. They apply freshman year, meet once a week for their entire high school career to run what in essence is a $30,000 a year charity. They put together all of the rehearsals, they put together all of the dances, they choose the contestants, they write all the thank you notes for the fundraisers, they organize all the fundraisers, and they keep track of all the money that is raised, whereas the boys show up for a 3-month stint and perform doing things like drag. And the girls point out how sexist this is, as Reagan says. It's the most blatant example of girls doing all the work and guys getting all the credit. Now, one year when I was there, a girl tried to challenge this. She said, I'm going to try out to become a contestant. right? There had never been a girl contestant before. She tries out to become a girl contestant, and she is repeated, while she finally makes it, she becomes a contestant with all the boys, she's repeatedly marginalized throughout the process. Uh, when the boys do their sort of sexy dances in drag, she ends up just sort of sitting on the side because it's not funny for a girl to dress in drag in the way that those boys are doing it. The young women who run the pageant repeatedly say the boys for the contestants, and then look over at her and say, and cat. She is often left off of events and not brought to events, right? And as one of the coordinators said, well, if a girl goes up there and does what the guys are doing, people would just be so angry with them. Right? So I came to question why the girls participated in this outmoded gendered ritual, right? That prepares them to do the work of mothering in and outside of schools and workplaces, right? These high-powered girls who are college going and honors classes, even have feminist stickers on their bottles. Why are they doing all of the work for this event that boys get the glory for? Well, much like discussions of systemic inequality are avoided in the name of politics, right? Systemic gendered inequalities are avoided at the school through a sort of girl boss feminist approach, a feminism that both requires girls be empowered to fight against misogyny, but also allows girls to leverage race and class inequality to secure resources through rituals like the pageant, much like E.B. Du Bois points out in terms of psychological wages, or Denise Candiotti points out in terms of patriarchal bargains. Most of the girls who are involved in the pageant actually run the Women's Empowerment Club at American High as well, right? And so they talk often about being harassed at the school. They tell me that they've had pictures taken of them without their consent. They are hit on when they go to the grocery store by old men. They are sent dick pics on a regular basis. And that the school, when they complain about this, does sort of nothing, right? In fact, the school tells them that your body, your choice means that you have the responsibility to have an exit plan to get out of sexually dangerous situations when they are trained in a sexual harassment training with the vice principal. And indeed, girls themselves have a hard time naming the sort of harassment they experience, and instead use words like strange, creepy, gross, stupid, appalling, annoying, sad, disgusting, tragic, and weird to talk about things like sexism, inequality, harassment, or misogyny. So what we have is a set of girls running a $30,000 a year pageant that depends on things like heterosexuality and heteronormativity to secure advantages for boys, while also reproducing the idea that drag exists to make fun of queer folks and queer culture, not to empower queer young folks and queer culture. So while it seems like protests in support of Black lives, a drag show, an annual philanthropic event, and stories of gendered violence may seem to have little in common, when we look at all of those events at American High, they tell us something about what I came to think of as a politics of protection, or the way that an organizational logic of apolitical kindness and inclusion obfuscates and thus reproduces many existing class, race, gender, and sexual inequalities by framing the biggest dangers to young folks as individual and random rather than systemic or preventable. The concept of a politics of protection captures the way that the language of bullying and kindness, when paired with an avoidance of the political, is a logic that obfuscates organizational practices of gender, race, class, and sexual inequalities. But by locating the harm in individual incivility and bullying, this logic not only obfuscates these systemic inequalities, it can also reproduce them. And so I want to conclude with a few thoughts about some sociological and practical lessons we can take from American High. Practical lessons first. Schools need to be empowered to develop and deploy a language of inequality. rather than relying so heavily just on a kindness discourse to combat bullying. Avoiding politics in schools means we avoid the language of inequality. And developing a language of inequality might mean employing strategies like restorative justice, or even better, transformative justice, expanding things like social studies, instituting laws about requiring ethnic studies like California, Oregon, and Washington have, or using protests as teachable moments. And certainly, it goes without saying, pushing back on things like book bans, don't say gay laws, and restrictive approaches to sex education. Second, it means recognizing that schools are sexual organizations. Sex ed doesn't just happen in formal sex ed classes, it happens in school rituals and events, right? Sexual meanings are inscribed in the lived environment and in policy, right? At the very least, we need to have trained teachers teaching things like teaching sexuality content, something over half the states right now don't require. Third, we need to look at the social life of schools, right? We have so much research focused on the formal processes of schooling, but we need to continually be reviewing rituals for inclusivity and the messages they send, like the 2 instances of drag that are occurring at American High. Finally, sociological lessons. Organizational scholarship is often focused on workplaces, but would also benefit from a focus on schools and churches as well. And doing so means that we need to pay attention to young folks as organizational actors. Right now, young folks are almost entirely absent from literature on organizations. Every once in a while, we see research on youth as activists in organizations. Hava Gordon's work is a good example of this. Second, we need to think not just about the way that intersectional inequalities marginalize young folks, but we also need to think about the way intersectional privilege gets produced, right? The way privilege itself gets disguised as merit in schools. Michaela Musto's forthcoming work on the production of brilliance among white boys in schools is a great example of this. And finally, we need to think about the power of positive emotions in upholding inequality. We've seen this a little bit in terms of gender, and Eduardo Benio Silva has been theorizing racialized emotions, which suggest the way that things like racial pleasure can uphold things like white supremacy. The social life of American High is a case study of larger cultural, organizational, and political practices regarding inequality. And in my analysis, the book makes an intersectional claim that challenges to any one of those systems of inequality implicates other inequalities, such that none of these challenges are legible within the school's regime of kindness and tolerance. So at a time when DEI work, committees, and statements are hailed as the response to organizational inequality, we need to think about the work that diversity claims, practices, and policies do. And I want to encourage us to keep a healthy skepticism about the fact that, as Dobbin and his co-authors suggest, the most popular reforms may also be the reforms that reproduce inequality rather than reduce them. And what I want to add to that is some of the most popular reforms are precisely the ones about being nice, embracing diversity, and avoiding politics. So we need to keep in mind not only that those approaches might reproduce inequality, but they might also obfuscate the fact that they are doing so. We'll stop there, and I'm happy to take questions. Oh, and I do want to point out that this is an image drawn by a student who read the book and responded to it. And so you can see his name there, and it captures it better than I could, so.
Hi, Dr. Pascoe.
Hey.
Thank you so much for this talk. I just thank you. It's so much food for nourishment. I wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit about this question of what came to be viewed as political, and whether what I heard in the stories that you told about what you saw, and the ways that people responded to different things, it sounded like what we might usually think of as kind of progressivist notions were regularly politicized and conservativist notions were not. Is that true? And if so, what do you think that tells us about this notion of politicization in schools? Or what it means for us understanding it?
Right. So I think you're making a really important point, right? That it's not just issues about resource distribution or morality that get defined as political, but it's resource distribution or morality that are different from the status quo or challenge the status quo. And that's what I hear you saying. And I think that that is actually really an important addition to what it is I'm saying, right? That it's, if it doesn't challenge the status quo, it might not be called political, right? I think, and I wonder, because often ethnography can suggest a lot of things, but we can't always claim a lot of things. And so I think what would be fascinating is if someone who has these skills could do a sort of experiment, right, and set up different vignettes where they look at sort of practices that challenge the status quo and those that don't, right? Or more thoroughly distribute resources or expand protections, right? And how likely those things are to get called political, because it seems like what you're suggesting and pointing out about this data, and I agree with you, is that it's those things that sort of expand protections and work to empower more people such that they challenge the status quo that then get called political. Yeah, that's a really important point. Thank you. And I think something, sorry, I was going to share another story. Something I didn't share here was when, so there was one time there was a Martin Luther King Day celebration, as there are at many schools, and that's not considered political, unlike kneeling in support of Black lives. And there's a bunch of students sort of up on the stage talking about what Martin Luther King Jr. Day means to them, and it's mostly students of color up on the stage, and several students come late to the assembly, and they're white students, and they come into the assembly all wearing red "Make America Great Again" hats, and they come and sit in the very front and center of the assembly in front of these students who are talking about racial equality and justice, and the students were, obviously like horrified by this, and the school remained silent on it. And I was told that the school remained silent because everybody's perspective had to be respected, right? That a diversity of perspectives have to be respected, and so it was okay that they wore those hats, right? And so that would suggest then that not challenging the status quo through actual political speech perhaps is not seen as problematically political, right? So I just wanted to share that with you because I think it supports your analysis. So thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions? We probably have time. We definitely have time for one more, maybe two, depending.
Walter, did you just raise your hand? Yeah, you can unmute yourself. You should be able to unmute yourself right now. I can also ask you to unmute.
Okay, there it goes. I was having trouble. Thanks so much for the presentation. My question, and it might be sort of beyond the questions you were asking in the book, but I'm really interested from all the time you spent in the school and the interviews, where you landed in terms of thinking about where this organizational logic came from.
Mm-hmm.
Like what were the sources at the school, from the parents, from the school board? Like where was this kind of getting life and sustaining it? Because we sort of see this obfuscation of systemic and structural inequality in favor of more interpersonal understanding approaches in other aspects of society. And just curious, like what you took away from how it was being reproduced and manifesting itself in the school, and what was maybe driving or sustaining that.
So I actually have thank you. That's a great question. I actually have two responses. One is a little more cynical and the others are more earnest. So I'm going to lead with the earnest one. And the earnest one is that, and this comes out of my sort of several previous research projects. So like when I was researching homophobic harassment and heterosexist harassment in the early 2000s, I ended up writing this whole book about homophobic bullying without using the word bullying in it. And I didn't think of myself as a bullying scholar, right? And it wasn't until I started getting calls from reporters asking me to talk about bullying, and then eventually like became part of like Lady Gaga's anti-bullying sort of organization, that I was like, why didn't I use the word bullying when I was writing in the early 2000s about all of this harassment? And so I looked back and I looked at the New York Times, I looked at the list or public discourse around bullying, and it just simply wasn't around in the early 2000s. We started seeing a massive uptick in discussions of bullying once we saw sort of cell phone use become ubiquitous among teens, or about 2008. We start to see this sort of discussion about bullying sort of permeate American society. We see a sort of website on it at the White House, which stood through Trump's presidency, interestingly. And just all these organizations start to talk about bullying, and we see all these sort of like plug and play programs start happening at schools around bullying. And so and so that's where all that niceness stuff comes from, right? That we rightly so, we're like, maybe we should pay attention to the emotional lives of youth and encourage people to approach each other with kindness, right? So like, I think that's a really, really good thing. I don't think that's a bad thing at all. However, what I think then happened was that became then the much easier language to use when it came to these inequalities that were getting reproduced at the schools, right? Because we weren't then thinking about, well, what are kids getting bullied for, right? And when we look at the data, kids get bullied for body size, they get bullied for class status, well, which manifests in appearance, they get bullied along lines of sexuality, along gender lines, along racial lines, right? So we know that it's all sorts of social inequalities that then kids get bullied for. And so we didn't take them that next step, right? And say like, okay, it's not just about being nice. Let's talk about difference and inequality, right? Not just difference, but difference and inequality. And so that's my earnest response. My more cynical response is that it takes money, it takes effort, systemic change is hard, right? That we don't have this sort of will or momentum or finances necessary to do some of the work that needs to be done, and groups in power don't want to give up power, right? So I think that's my more like cynical response. So I think it's two of those things. Does that make sense? Okay, awesome. Happy to answer other questions. I can't like unmute or really call on people because I can't use my buttons on my computer. So going to rely on you to volunteer to make your voices heard.
Michael, can I ask, I know we are at time. Dr. Pascoe, do you have a few minutes to answer some questions?
Yeah.
Okay. Those of you that do need to go, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate you. There's another Lunch and Learn next week, same time, so please join us then. So goodbye to those who have to go. And Molly, go ahead with your question.
Well, I think my question kind of aligns a little bit with the question that was asked in the chat by Laura as well. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for this talk and the body of work that you've contributed. It's been really influential, even when I was a doctoral student, thinking about possibilities for my own research. So thank you for the work that you do. I was wondering if you could speak to how some of these structural characteristics, so things like policies that restrict conversation around controversial topics, how that can shut down critiques of the system and contribute to kind of an anti-intellectualism or feelings among staff about their ability to talk about inequalities. and whether or not you saw staff that were marginalized in different ways talk about exiting the system.
Yeah, right. So you're raising a really important point and something I tried to be incredibly careful of when I wrote the book, which is to not say teachers need to, right? Um, for a whole host of reasons, we place so much responsibility at the feet of teachers who are already overtaxed, underpaid, and doing their absolute best to keep our little guys safe, right, in their schools. And my wife is a teacher, so like there's a very personal connection there. Um, and so what I saw actually, and so I'll speak about what I saw and then sort of talk a little bit more about maybe what we can do, is that the only teacher who allied with students around things like, so there were multiple moments where teachers cleared organizational space for students. When they put on a Black Lives Matter display that the administration didn't want, when they staged a walkout around gun control, when they staged a walkout around climate change, and oh gosh, and the drag show, right? So there are these 4 moments where it took staff sort of holding organizational space for the students so that they could do these moments. All the staff who did that are now gone from the school except one. The one white woman staff member is still there, right? All the other staff members were staff of color, and then there was one white man who ended up going and getting a degree in counseling, so he's a therapist now. And so that was quite something to watch, and I've talked to all of them, right, about that process, and nobody thinks it's an accident, including the one white woman who's left. She's like, no, it's not an accident that I'm there. I need to stay and keep fighting. And so I think there's a couple of messages that come out of that, which is, one, what I saw that was successful was not teachers battling administration head on, right? Because sometimes they tried that and it never worked, or rarely worked. What happened was them sort of empowering students kind of behind the scenes, right? Where they were like, hey, here's what you need to explain about drag, right? Or, hey, what if we pitch the Black Lives Matter display as an educational moment rather than a political one, right? So like really guiding students through their own activism. Even when that poster, the one about the global climate change strike, the students said that those were all taken down throughout the school. And so the teacher who was the advisor to the club that was doing it was like, I mean, I can't tell you to put the posters back up, but she raises her hand up with her phone and then she's like, but you've got these, maybe use these, right? And then puts it down and kind of walks away. So like that kind of thing. So I think that's one thing that staff can do. I think the other thing that staff can do is hopefully to stand in solidarity with each other, right? Because I think what happened at American that allowed some of this pushback was that the staff were incredibly tight, right? And stood aligned with one another. And so like when the staff of color was pushing for something and the administration was like, no, there were 2 white male staff members who often had more, like could get the ear of the admin better. And so they would then step in and start it, right? And so I think standing in solidarity is really key. I don't know if any of that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. It's a great question. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for those excellent questions. Thank you, Dr. Pascoe, for joining us today and sharing your work with us.
Thank you again so much, Dr. Pascoe. That was phenomenal.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate it. It was wonderful to be here. I really appreciate it. So thank you.
Yeah.